Good morning. It's good to be with you on this Tuesday morning as we continue together in our time in First Corinthians. First Corinthians is a fun book. There's always a lot of things that Paul talks about in First Corinthians that seem to be quite complicated. Corinthians always makes me think of one of my favorite statements by one of my professors in college, Dr. Harold Bryson. Dr. Bryson, you would always talk about Paul, and he'd always say this. He said, we'd rather talk about Paul than Jesus. He said, um, Paul's hard to understand. Paul says some stuff that can be complicated and can be hard to understand. He said, Jesus isn't hard to understand. Jesus is just hard to follow. And I think a lot about that because there's a lot of things in Paul's writings, and we're going to see some of them today that can be challenging. Goodness, the last few chapters have been challenging. Um, that can we can spend a lot of time debating and talking about. And whereas Jesus isn't really hard to understand. Jesus is just hard to follow. Loving your enemies is not complicated. I just don't want to do it. Forgiving those who harm you is not complicated. I just don't want to do it. Blessing those who curse you is not complicated. I just don't want to do it. And so I like to always, in Paul's work, drill down to the kernel of what he's telling us. What is at the root of what he's speaking to us about, and trying to take that and go from that. So let's look at Paul's teaching on marriage today and see what he's telling us. So we're going to read 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 16. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to his husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Never deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then to come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. To the married and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried, as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does separate, let her husband remain unmarried, or if, or if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I will say, and I am not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And likewise, any woman who has a husband who is an unbeliever, he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Likewise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband, and husband, for all you know, you may save your wife. So Paul here is teaching about marriage and teaching about. I hope you heard in Paul what I think the kernel of that he wants us to really drill down and understand is this: we do not live for ourselves. Everything in this teaching, whether it be marriage or singleness, loving each other, we our sexual relations as spouses, no matter where you are in this, it's not about you as much as it is about your spouse. I always think of it's a line. I don't remember which one of the founding fathers said it, but I just love it. So I think it applies to so many situations. He said, "You have the right to swing your fist in as much as it does not hit your neighbor's nose." And I just love that concept because we can do what we want. I mean, we can do it. You are free to do whatever it is you want to do. You are completely free to do that. But like we talked about yesterday, just because you can does not mean that you should. So my life, my body, my very being does not belong only to me. But first off, it belongs to the Lord. That's the key. It belongs to the Lord first. Secondly, it belongs to Holly. It belongs to my wife. I don't live for me. And I think that's what Paul is trying to say here, that we do not live simply for ourselves, but we live first to God and then to others. And notice he says, and this is something I think is interesting here, as Paul says, first off in chapter 7, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote me. So the Corinthians have written to Paul some questions and said, hey, Paul, what are we to do with this? Tell us what you think. And then Paul is saying these are specific things. And understanding Paul sometimes, remember, Paul is complicated. It's challenging to understand what he is speaking to this individual church with rules for them and comments for them versus what he's saying to the wider church. And here, specifically, we see that Paul is speaking to Corinth about specific things. And then he even says this, verse 12, he says, to the rest I say, and I am not the Lord, that if any believers has a wife, so on and so forth. So Paul's here saying, listen, guys, I'm telling you what I think and what I believe. And once again, I love this. We see in Corinthians over and over and over again the humanness of Paul. That scripture here is not to be taken apart from from Paul's humanity in some ways. That God is using this vessel of Paul to speak to us authoritative scripture, that God is speaking to us his word and speaking to us his will and speaking to us what he wants us to know through this vessel of Paul. And that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool that God is using Paul to do this. So I wanted you to hear that context first, but I think it's important for us to understand that for Paul, when it comes to marriage, and also when it comes to every relationship, we don't live just for ourselves, but we live for others. And then he says to those who are not married, that's stay single. It's fine. And I think that's important for us to say too, because sometimes if we're not careful, as much as I love my wife and my kids and my family, we don't want to deify our families. We don't want to make our families our God. And let's be clear, my family runs my life, runs my budget, runs my schedule, runs everything. But God's always got to come first. And I think that's his teaching to the widows, those who are without husband, to those who are unmarried. It's not about your life is not unfulfilled if you are not married, because your life is found in Jesus. Your life is no matter what your station is, married, single, divorced, lots of children, no children, lots of grandchildren, no grandchildren. It doesn't matter. That does not define who you are. What defines who you are is your relationship with Jesus. It's your relationship with Jesus that is the ultimate definition of who you are. And so we want to be very careful not to bank our identity on something, even a good thing like our spouse or our children. They're not, they're not your sole identity. They're a key identity for you and they're a major part of your life, but they're not all you are. And they can't sit on the throne of your heart. I probably shared that. I know I've shared this with you before. The teaching from Tim Keller. Tim Keller said that anything you put on the throne of your heart other than Jesus will disorient your life, even if that thing is a good thing. So if you put your spouse on the throne of your heart, if you put your children on the throne of your heart, things will not work just right. Because if your children are on the throne of your heart, that means your identity is found completely in them, which means you're going to expect perfection from your children, which, if you're not careful, that pressure will crush them. And then likewise, if your children are on the throne of your heart and define all that you are, what happens when your children mess up or fail? Then your identity is skewed. So you got to put Jesus on the throne. You got to put Jesus on the throne. If Jesus is on the throne, everything else falls into the proper place. So I think one of the questions we can always ask ourselves is, what is it that's truly sitting on the throne of our heart? Is it Jesus or is it something else? So we want to be careful about that. But I think the core of Paul's teaching here today is that we don't exist for ourselves. That is not, I don't live for myself. I live for Jesus. and I honor my wife. My life is not my own. It belongs to the Lord. And I want to make sure that I honor him with all that I am. And I want to make sure that I live my life, not devoted to just what Andy wants, but that I devote my life to honoring my spouse, being a good dad, being a good pastor, being a good friend, but also knowing at all times that my core identity is always found in Jesus. So today, you don't live for yourself. You live for others. You live for God. Hey, thanks for being with us today. Hope you have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.